Good evening, everybody. Before I have the privilege of introducing this evening's speaker, I have a couple of notices. Firstly, it's membership renewal time, and members, you should have received an email earlier this week inviting you to get online and renew your membership for the next year. As you know, we are a membership organisation and only exist because of you and your subscriptions. So please, can I encourage you to process your renewal promptly? We need you, as we are nothing without you. For any of you joining this evening who are not members, as Russell has already said, you are most welcome. And as we are just about to start our new membership year, there's never been a more perfect time to join the Society. So full details of how to join are on our website, and we would be delighted if you could support the work of the Society and sign up and become a member. Secondly, a reminder of our upcoming events. Next month, we are hosting a webinar on the 8th of July, usual time, 5:30, on the subject of religion and marriage law, the need for reform, where an expert panel will mark the launch of Professor Russell Sandberg's new book. The panel members are a distinguished group and include Baroness Hale of Richmond, Professor Gillian Douglas, and Professor Jane Eyre. And the moderator will be, and in case you've been missing him, our very own former chairman, Mark Hill QC. Then we have the next London lecture is on September the 15th, where you will have the opportunity to hear the Dean of the Arches, Morag Ellis QC, and Morag will be speaking on clean and green law and the carbon neutral church. The next and final Northern Province lecture for the year will be October 20th, where we will have our very own Russell and one of our trustees, Stephen Coleman, who will be speaking on the canons of the Church of England, reflections on some fundamentals of ecclesiastical law. Some of you will be familiar with the work Russell and Stephen have been doing earlier in the year. And then we'll be closing our year on on 17th of November with our final London lecture, where we will have Peter Collier QC, who will be speaking to us on 50 years of safeguarding, 950 years of clergy discipline. Where do we go from here? All the details of these upcoming events are on our website. The two London lectures have been planned to hopefully take place in person, but the July webinar and the Northern Province October lecture will remain online. Now, may I welcome Bishop Christine Hardman as our speaker this evening. As many of you will know, Bishop Christine has been Bishop of Newcastle since 2015. She was first licensed as a deaconess in 1984. She was ordained deacon in 1987 and ordained priest in 1994. She trained on the St Albans ministry course and was in various forms of parish ministry in St Albans from 1984 until 2001. She was also a tutor on and later director of the St Albans and Oxford ministry course from 1988 to 1996. She was then Archdeacon of Lewisham from 2001 to 2012 and was at Southwark Cathedral from 2012 until her appointment as Bishop of Newcastle in 2015, finally reaching the promised land of the Northern Province. She has been on the General Synod almost continuously since 1998, having served on the Eucharistic Prayer Revision Committee, the Diocese and Pastoral Measure Review Group, and the Ethical Investment Advisory Group. She has done all this without losing her kindness and intuitive wisdom. It is a history which shows a total dedication to the Church, an openness to God's grace, and huge energy. We are absolutely delighted that Bishop Christine has found time to speak to us this evening. She's uniquely well placed to tell us the importance of ecclesiastical law in facilitating the mission of the Church, and we look forward to hearing from her. Bishop Christine.
It's very, very good to be with you this evening, and I feel privileged to be invited. I've loved watching, I've got the list of participants up on the right of my screen, and it's been wonderful to see lots of new names, but also to see some very good friends who are here tonight. Wonderful. Lizzie, your introduction was so kind. What you didn't mention was that the period between retiring as Archdeacon of Lewisham in 2012 and being consecrated Bishop of Newcastle in the end of 2015 I was an honorary priest at Southwark Cathedral, but I was actually retired. And I had 3 wonderful years of retirement. And I think I'm probably the only bishop who's ever been appointed out of retirement. And that will probably remain a unique vocation, but it's lovely to be with you. When Canon Williams invited me to address this meeting, I thought it would be a relatively easy task. Not, of course, in fact, my words about this meeting, but the words of Alan Bennett on being asked to address the Prayer Book Society in his book, Writing Home. When Canon Williams asked me to address this meeting, I thought it would be a relatively easy task. He had sent me some of the contributions of my distinguished predecessors in this place, and what seemed to be required was a celebration of the merits and qualities of the Book of Common Prayer, as opposed to such versions as have succeeded, though not superseded it, plus some personal thoughts or reminiscences along the lines of the prayer book and me. So he begins his talk, his address to the Prayer Book Society in the 1990s. What was extraordinary was that as he wrote this address, he found himself going into a very different direction to the one he'd expected. He thought it would be easy. He loved the language of the Book of Common Prayer and a deep enthusiast for it. But he found himself thinking about the funeral of the lady in the van. I know many of you will be so familiar with that story. And he recalled her funeral service. And he realized that at one level it was dreadful. It was liturgically dreadful. But he realized the depth in it, and that his liturgical fastidiousness was sheer snobbery. And then he thought of a young curate taking the sacrament to someone sick on the 14th floor of a tower block, going up in the lift, trying not to breathe in the stench of urine. He ends his address, "Cranmer did not die for English prose." And so I too thought, when I received an invitation to be your speaker this evening, that it would be a relatively easy task, reflecting further on an article published in Church Times over 3 years ago now, entitled "The Church's Servant, Not Its Master," in which I argued that ecclesiastical law should be seen as facilitating mission and not hindering it. But just as Alan Bennett found himself, to his surprise, entering a very different and deeper landscape, so I too have found myself on an unexpected journey with a different destination from the one I had imagined. And so while I believe wholeheartedly that ecclesiastical law at its best does indeed facilitate mission, I found myself wanting to focus on its even more profound nature, which I believe is to protect the very identity and nature of the Church of England. As an archdeacon in Southwark Diocese in the 2000s, I was delighted to be invited by the then Canon Chancellor, the Venerable Dr. Jane Steen, soon of course to be consecrated next week, in fact, to the See of Lynn, and a member of this society, to co-lead a course with Mark Stedman, also a member of this society, now Archdeacon of Stone Lindsay, entitled "The Legalities and Obligations of Incumbency." And the course was for curates undertaking their IME2 training. The experience of that IME2 course was very telling. I think most of the curates, seeing it on the timetable, gave an inward groan, and the more courteous of them prepared to hide their boredom. In fact, how it turned out was that we knew from the feedback that it was one of the most popular courses of the scheme, and they valued it very much indeed. I believe the reason the course was so valued was its foundational relevance to the nature of the ministry to which they'd been called. It confirmed for me that Rowan Williams, who I quoted in that article in Church Times 3 years ago, was characteristically spot on in his observation in his foreword to The Confluence of Law and Religion, that thinking about the law of the church is thinking about practical ecclesiology, how the life of the church recognises and nurtures the shared dignity and liberty of the children of God. Those of you who know me well will not be surprised to learn that I am basing my reflection tonight both on these words of Rowan Williams and on the very well-known words of another former Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, beginning with the quote for which he is probably most famous: "The Church is the only society that exists for the benefit of those who are not its members." Let me begin by reflecting on the significance of ecclesiastical law in defining the very identity and nature of the Church of England. Let's begin with the foundation canons of the Church of England, in particular, Canon A1 of the Church of England. The Church of England, established according to the laws of this realm under the Queen's Majesty, belongs to the true and apostolic Church of Christ. And as our duty to the said Church of England requires, we do constitute and ordain that no member thereof shall be at liberty to maintain or hold the contrary. This canon makes it quite clear that the Church of England is established by law, and the Church of England is a church, not a sect. It might be thought this does not need saying, but during the long years when I and many others were involved in working on the legislation needed to enable women to be ordained to the episcopate, the importance of this canon became very clear to me. Those involved in that debate on both sides of the argument recognised that the identity of the Church of England and the nature of the episcopate were inextricably linked. Canon A4 was key in this debate: the form and manner of making and ordaining and consecrating of bishops, priests, and deacons. Annexed to the Book of Common Prayer and commonly known as the Ordinal, is not repugnant to the Word of God. And those who are so made, ordained, or consecrated, bishops, priests, or deacons, according to the said Ordinal, are lawfully made, ordained, or consecrated, and ought to be accounted, both by themselves and others, to be truly bishops, priests, or deacons. The question that was very much around in that debate as we thought about the nature of the Church of England and its identity was, does the Church of England have the authority to ordain? And are those the Church ordains truly ordained? I discovered that I cared more about the answer to that question than to the specific question of the admission of women to the episcopate. As a member of the group which drew up the draft of the 5 guiding principles, I argued, happily successfully, that it was important, reflecting Canon A4, to include the notion of truly as well as lawfully. And the first principle does do this. Now that legislation has been passed to enable women to become bishops, the Church of England is fully and unequivocally committed to all orders of ministry being open to all without reference to gender, and holds that those whom it has duly ordained and appointed to office are the true and lawful holders of the office which they occupy, and thus deserve due respect and canonical obedience. Canon A8 refers to schisms. For as much as the Church of Christ has for a long time past been distressed by separations and schisms among Christian men, so that the unity for which our Lord prayed is impaired, and the witness to his gospel is grievously hindered, it is the duty of clergy and people to do their utmost, not only to avoid occasions of strife, but also to seek in penitence and brotherly charity to heal such divisions. And the 4th and 5th principles seem to me to be rooted in the aspiration of the last of the foundation canons, when we have number 4, since those within the Church of England who on grounds of theological conviction are unable to receive the ministry of women bishops or priests continue to be within the spectrum of teaching and tradition of the Anglican Communion, the Church of England remains committed to enabling them to flourish within its life and structures. And finally, pastoral and sacral provision for the minority within the Church of England will be made without specifying a limit of time and in a way that maintains the highest possible degree of communion and contributes to mutual flourishing across the whole Church of England, the very opposite, of course, of schism. I find it reassuring and personally important that the 5 guiding principles seem to me to be deeply rooted in those foundation canons, are broadly consonant with them, and with the understanding that we have from those canons of the very core nature of our church. This is the Church of England, then, established in law, a church, not a sect, that exists for the benefit of those who are not its members. This quotation from William Temple is so familiar that we can lose the shocking nature of its claim. In our very essence, William Temple says, in our very essence, we exist not for ourselves and our own interests, but to serve those who are outside the church. This is God's mission in which we are called to share. We exist not for ourselves, but to serve those who are outside the church. This notion and understanding of the nature of the Church of England and our vocation is under challenge in our present culture from at least 2 directions. The first challenge comes from those outside the church who believed we should not comment on or be involved in the major societal issues of our time. This is the attempt to have religion, the Church of England, relegated to the domestic sphere. Its shorthand is stay out of politics, mind your own business. And every time someone like Archbishop Justin comments, of course, he's told very firmly to get back into the ghetto to which it is presumed he belongs in this outlook. The second challenge, I think, is actually more dangerous and it's more insidious because it comes from us, it comes from ourselves, it comes from inside the church. This challenge happens every time we resent people using the church, when we use that language, right? People using the church for their own purposes. It happened a lot more, of course, when the only place really, apart from a dreadfully dreary registry office, that you could be married was inside a church. And there was a deal of resentment from many quarters that people should just use the church for a nice building. We've learned, of course, now that we rather long now to see more of our weddings in church, and we have lost that market, and the same with funerals, actually. It happens every time a parish priest sees ministering to people who are not members through the occasional offices, particularly funerals perhaps, as a distraction from the main task of ministry, rather than being the main task of ministry. It happens every time we resent having to consult in the wider community about the closure of a church for regular worship. It happens every time we get angry about an objection to a faculty by someone outside the congregation. What's it got to do with them? I believe much of our ecclesiastical law enshrines the rights and interests of those who are not our members. And of course, this can be a source of irritation when we find this inconvenient. The canons relating to the occasional offices are one example of this. A parish priest cannot refuse or unduly delay the baptism of infants to those who are not church members. And if he or she does, the parents or guardians have recourse to the bishop. And to quote Canon B38 on the burial of the dead, it shall be the duty of every minister to bury, according to the rites of the Church of England, the corpse or ashes of any person deceased within his cure. Deceased within his cure does not, of course, just mean deceased members of the congregation. It's the cure of souls for the parishioners, for the community. It seems to me that as we become increasingly anxious in the Church of England about declining numbers, apparent increasing irrelevance to many people in wider society, and our financial pressures, we're in danger of becoming a church which becomes more self-absorbed, more anxious, and more defensive. I don't believe it's an exaggeration to say that we are in danger of losing our very identity as the Church of England, our soul, if you like, if we succumb to this instinct and retreat from William Temple's vision of being an outward-looking church, which in Rowan Williams' words recognises and nurtures the shared dignity and liberty of the children of God. My final reflection on ecclesiastical law and its defence and facilitation of mission in its most serious sense in William Temple's terms is perhaps surprising. Indeed, I have completely surprised myself. Whoever would have thought that I would end my talk this evening with a consistory court judgment on a faculty application, but that is what I find myself compelled to do. The judgment was made in the consistory court of the Diocese of Southwark in 2002, when Charles George was the Chancellor, in response to a petition of David Leslie Godfrey. David Godfrey was the son of Leslie Allison Godfrey and Kathleen, known as Kitty Godfrey. And the son wished to install a memorial plaque to his parents in St. Mary's, Wimbledon. To set the scene, I now quote from the judgment, and it describes Kitty and Leslie Godfrey. Kathleen Godfrey is described thus in Bud Collins' Tennis Encyclopedia. Kathleen McCain Godfrey, a sturdy, good-natured competitor, may have been the best female player Britain has produced. In winning Wimbledon for the first time in 1924, she charged back from 1-4 in the second set to hand Helen Wills her lone defeat in 9 visits to the Big W. Kitty won Wimbledon again 2 years later over Lily de Alvarez. Thus, Kitty and Dorothy Round were the only Brits to win twice since World War I. Speedy, smart, and a fighter with an all-round game, she was her country's most successful Olympian, gathering 5 medals in the 1920 and 1924 games. Born May 7, 1896 in London, she died there at the age of 96, June the 19th, 1992. Her husband, Leslie Allison Godfrey, was also a distinguished tennis player. Born in 1895, he won the men's doubles at Wimbledon in 1923, married Kitty McCain in 1926, and as has already mentioned, won the mixed doubles with his wife in that year. He served in the 2 world wars, was twice decorated, including the Military Cross, and died in 1971. 3 days after Kitty Godfrey's death in 1992, her son went to see the then rector, Canon Parrott, to ask whether his mother's funeral service could be held at St. Mary's. It was judged that the church was too small for the numbers expected, and in the event, the funeral service took place in Barnes. But Canon Parrott suggested that Kitty Godfrey's ashes be interred in the Garden of Remembrance at St. Mary's, and this is what happened. Canon Parrott asked her son whether he would like a small plaque in the church, and they discussed a possible site. Unfortunately, Canon Parrott hadn't consulted the PCC and was undoubtedly taken aback by their reaction to the request, which was that since the end of the First World War, no plaques had been installed in St. Mary's, and the PCC were not willing to make an exception for the Godfreys. The matter of principle stated by St. Mary's PCC is significant, and I quote again from the judgment. The matter of principle is that the memorial tablets at present in church relate to people who had close and long-standing associations with worshipping in St. Mary's building. Although no one wishes to doubt for one moment the great fame based upon the outstanding achievements of the Godfreys, their merit is not primarily based upon their association with St. Mary's Church. It was pointed out that many other famous persons have lived in Wimbledon over the years and are not on those qualifications alone commemorated with memorial plaques inside the church. The saga was a long one, involving the DAC, the area bishop, and the archdeacon. In 1997, there was a further approach to the PCC, which was again rejected on the grounds that it would be an unwelcome precedent to allow a permanent memorial to be placed in church where there was an absence of a substantial connection with the worshipping life of St. Mary's. And there it rested until June 2001, when David Godfrey lodged his petition, presumably having discovered the consistory court had the final determination. The PCC continued to lodge strong objections, not only on the grounds of no worshipping connection, but also that it might be opening the floodgates for further memorials for other deceased tennis champions. The DAC also believed the proposals were unacceptable. Supporting the reasons given by the PCC, the DAC also criticised the proposed wording and the fact that it had nothing about faith in it. The exposition of the law relating to the granting of a faculty is, as you might expect from Charles George, measured, forensic, and wise. But for reasons of time, I'm not going to go into that detailed argument now, but you may enjoy, if you look it up, you may enjoy it very much. But I do want to quote from his concluding comments. The Church of England is a national established church, and I see no reason why commemoration within a particular church should be confined to those who have worshipped in that church on a regular basis during some part of their life. On the other hand, I can understand the desire to curtail the number of those whose commemoration may be sought, and normally some local connection will be requisite. The fact that Kitty Godfrey's triumphs were local ones at the nearby All England Club alone achieves that local connection, but even more so is the fact that her ashes are interred in the Garden of Remembrance. That gives her a close and direct connection with St Mary's. I understand and respect the PCC's concern not to set a precedent, and their fear that they may receive a flood of applications for memorials for tennis players. In reality, however, post-war history suggests that the number of British Wimbledon champions is exiguous and likely to remain so. And there would be no difficulty in distinguishing and refusing applications to commemorate foreign champions in the unlikely event that this was sought by their surviving relatives. If the further criteria are applied that the British champion, to be truly exceptional, must have won the championship more than once, as did Kitty Godfrey, and been interred in St Mary's Garden of Remembrance, then the floodgates are likely to remain securely closed. The role of Canon Parrott, again from the judgment. If I found this a borderline case, then the early encouragement given to the petitioner by the then rector would be a relevant consideration, although he ought not to have given as much encouragement to the petitioner as he did. However, I have not found this as a borderline case. In any event, as will be apparent, I consider that Karen Parrott was right to appreciate the exceptional nature of Kitty Godfrey's achievements and to have been surprised when his PCC took so restrictive a view of who could properly be commemorated in their church. When, as an archdeacon in Southwark, I had first sight of this judgment, which came round for us all to see, all the archdeacons, it didn't, of course, relate to my own archdeaconry. I wanted to cheer, and I have always remembered it. I wanted to cheer because this judgment made me proud that the petitioner was able to have his petition considered so carefully, with due regard to the law and precedent, and with a sense that right and fairness should prevail. Above all, I wanted to cheer because the understandable, but ultimately to me at any rate, narrow view of the PCC, elevating the interests of members of the church, even above the achievements of such an outstanding woman, that did not prevail. Cranmer did not die for English prose. And the Church of England, in my view, must not be allowed to become a club with members' privileges, for that to be its prime identity. Our ecclesiastical law, at its best, sometimes surprisingly, can defend against this narrow and defensive perspective. It can do no more, no less than help us to fulfill our vocation as the Church of England to share in God's mission.
Bishop Christine, goodness me, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. And you've really shown us how ecclesiastical law can empower. And it's a great encouragement to all the lawyers listening to you today. And we've got some questions coming in, but one of my own, as an ecclesiastical lawyer listening to you, is how can we make sure that our legal structures remain a means to an end and not an end in themselves, which I think is what the sort of subtext of what you've been talking to us about today. I wonder if you could say anything about that, please.
Yes, I think it's very, very important that we look at the substance, the underlying principle that a law is intending to protect or proclaim. And once we start to elevate the inevitably more superficial structure, we could get into real difficulty, actually. And of course, our structures, it's really like that comment from Alan Bennett about Cranmer not dying for English prose. And he wasn't decrying the beauty of the prose in Cranmer's texts, but saying we really have to get to the deeper meaning at the heart of it all. And we have to look at what our laws are there to do. And there'll be times, of course, when they become completely irrelevant because things change. And by changing, we're not then turning our back on our identity. We're making ourselves more fit to inhabit that identity in the world in which we now live. So I'm absolutely not arguing for no change in that sense.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. The members, has anybody got any questions that they would like to put to Bishop Christine? I'm just going to quickly have a look at the chat box. We had some comments whilst you were speaking, Bishop. We had a comment from Charles Miners, who, in response to your quote from William Temple, who said, but surely every service organisation exists for the benefit of those others than its members.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it? I wonder if Charles has got an example of that. I mean, a charity like the Salvation Army or something, or is that what Charles was thinking of?
Perhaps we could, Charles may wish to raise his hand. We could.
Yep.
There you are, Charles.
Yep. I was thinking of any youth group, any tennis club, any organisation that for the benefit of the community.
Yes, I think you're undoubtedly right in that it can't be. I think the quote William Temple did say the only society.
Quite.
But I think that sense of not existing as a group of people to serve others, but to actually put the interests of those who are not within its grouping. I think there is a difference, actually.
Yeah. I suppose what I was thinking was, I mean, a residents group, an amenity society. There's a lot of organisations that try and make, in simplistic terms, the world a better place, and the local community better. That try and look after all sorts of look after the interests of the less fortunate in various ways. I don't question for a second that the church is in that category, but I just wondered whether he was right in saying it's the only organisation.
No, I think I shall ponder that, Charles. It's really a moot point, but I think it's whether we are determining as a society what other people's interests are and their best interests, or whether we're allowing those who are not our members to define their own interests, which are often inconvenient for us.
Yeah.
But, I think it's a great point.
Thank you, Charles. We have a question from Russell. Russell, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, thanks, Lizzie. Bishop, I really appreciate what you had to say about those Section A canons. I thought it was so good that the way you used them in what you were saying. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on whether it's important that those statements actually are canons, that they're there in the canons of the Church of England, and does that give them a different status? Are they used in a different way because they're canons, rather than, say, another formal expression, a resolution of the General Synod or the House of Bishops or something like that?
Yes, I think it is important. I see them as the foundation canons of the Church of England. These are the key. They are our foundation on which everything else is built. And even though now the language is archaic in some of those instances, but they express something really important. And I hadn't realized that I hadn't given them much thought at all, to be truthful, until all those years being involved in the question about the nature of the episcopate, which gets down to the very core sense of what are we as a church? Are we a church? And there was quite a lot of argument at the time that we did not, as a church, we were not a church in the sense that we had the authority to do this. And so, the way we came down on these questions, I think, was absolutely key as to our self-understanding, our self-identity. I suspect most people in the Church of England don't give the A canons very much thought, to be truthful. But I was grateful to be taken back to our foundations. And it is absolutely true that in the end, I did care far more about us being true to the nature of the Church of England, established by law, a church, not a sect. That I did care more about that than whatever the decision was about women in the episcopate. That quite surprised me. But I think it's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Russell. Anne-Marie has pointed out to me that Bishop Colin Buchanan, you've had your hand up, sorry, and I missed it. You didn't appear in one of my on my screen. Perhaps Russell can find you and unmute you. Russell, are you able to find Colin?
Colin's certainly on. That's it. Lovely.
There you are, Colin. We've got you. Thanks.
Your lecturer and I know each other rather well from of old.
We do.
And I'm not going to press on what she's expecting me to. But Christine, as a long-standing synodswoman and indeed a prolocutor, what view do you take of our mark of mission to reform the unjust structures of society when we are confronted with a political system that quite unjustly gives a representation in Westminster that is nothing like what the people of England want? And you and I are used to the transferable vote, which produces a fair result, but the Church of England, sitting on high moral ground, never says a word to the state about electoral systems. We are great here at failing to preach what we practice.
Yeah, I'm not entirely surprised at your question, Colin. Colin and I, it was the most wonderful time when we were working together, as Colin as Bishop of Woolwich and me as Archdeacon of Lewisham. It was a wonderful time. And when I was asked by Bishop Tom Butler to consider, and he was interviewing me, he asked me to go and be interviewed by Colin to see whether I would be the right colleague for Colin as Archdeacon of Lewisham. And Colin sat me down, having driven me around for 3 hours around the Archdeaconry, and knew every single bit of it, every single priest in his area. He sat me down with a cup of tea and said, okay, tell me what you wrote in your General Synod manifesto. And I said, I wrote, I'm a firm believer in the parochial system and the establishment of the Church of England. And Colin, you went, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. And you very beautifully still put up with me. And even though, this was something very true to your heart, this establishment. Transferable vote, you've been Electoral Reform Society. This has been an absolute commitment of yours for years and years and years. This will be irritating to you, but I'm still not convinced, actually, that in its practical outworking, that is the way we go for national electing parliaments. But I should probably spend more time really thinking about this, Colin.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because, you were going to say, yes, of course you should. But I kind of look at some places where they have transferable vote, and you never end up with a party with a majority. You always have to have coalitions, usually. And is that a good thing? Maybe it is. I haven't thought that it is, but now I mustn't say what I think about the present government. I shall stay quiet.
Go ahead.
But I'm not sure that does single transferable vote do us so well in the General Synod? I don't know.
Am I allowed to say anything back?
You are. Well, Lizzie's chairing.
Are you hearing me? Yeah.
We can hear you, Colin.
The transferable vote ensures that the spread of opinion and preferences across the diocese are shown in the result. If you have if you're going to elect 5 proctors, say from a diocese, and everybody had 5 votes, then any 40% can elect all 5, because everybody else's votes will be spread. And the only way to get a satisfactory representation is by the transferable vote, and it has proved invaluable in General Synod. The alternative would be absolutely awful in a Church of England which has got streams and parties which could disagree with each other, but can get proper representation in the Synod, and that's been a key to the Synod. But even more so would be in the country. And it doesn't. If you've got a majority, you don't have to have a coalition. In Ireland has had a majority government most of the years since partition in the south. There's a coalition coming up at the moment, I think, but it doesn't. If the 50% want a particular government, they get it. But at the moment, 36% can elect a government in the church in England.
Yeah, and I'm well aware, Colin, as you speak with such expertise on this, that it's a foolish person and a foolish woman who attempts to kind of have that argument in this lecture. And I think you have been absolutely outstanding in your continued passion for this. And I'm seeing in the chat actually quite a number of, this is raising quite a lot of people's interest.
It is indeed. It is.
Round.
Yes.
Thank you, Colin.
Colin, thank you. There's quite a lot going on in the chat. And the Charlotte Wild-Smith has raised a couple of comments. I'm not sure if you're wanting to ask these as questions, Charlotte, or if they're just comments that you're wanting to share with the group. If you would like to ask a question, perhaps you could put your hand up and Russell could spotlight you. Yes, there you are.
Yeah, so I come at this as a legal historian who has the rare distinction of having read every draft bill, act, parliamentary debate, committee, synod report, you name it, I've read it on clergy discipline since 1790 right up to the present. And I'm just struck by how much of what was said in tonight's lecture really echoes what was said repeatedly in Parliament in the 19th century about how essential law was to safeguarding the Church of England and its mission as a way of safeguarding the desire of various factions within it to pull apart and undermine the breadth of its mission, and as safeguarding its duties to the citizens of England and its public worship as a place where everyone could come together and meet and share fellowship. So I was just reflecting on that, but I also made me reflect. I've also done a fair amount of work on the development of lay representation and the birth of the Church Assembly, and just reflecting on the debates that were had there around the franchise and that tension between the desire of the Church to have the means of self-direction and a sense of corporate identity, and the desire not to impair its national mission and character, and that was very much perceived as a tension. The moment you narrow the franchise, you start to maybe err in the direction of a little holy club. So another question, but kind of
no, but really makes that's fascinating, and I really rings bells for me, Charlotte. And as you were talking, I was also thinking about something that I think for me it's all about abuse of power, actually, and in any institution, how do you be always watching out for how is power being used for good and how is power being used in an abusive way, and about power balances. And for a long time, we don't have it now, and that's a good thing, actually. But there were a lot of monopolies going on with the Church of England's monopoly on things like marriages, funerals, occasional offices, and we didn't know the precious gift with which we had been entrusted. We didn't recognise what a precious gift we had, and we didn't live up to our calling, actually. But I think for me, we've been looking a lot and learning a lot about how we use power, particularly those who have great authority and power in the church, and the power balance between clergy and laity, for example, between bishops and clergy and lay people. So I think that those questions that you're raising, I think, are fascinating and spot on, actually.
Thank you, Charlotte. I can see that David Lamming, you've had your hand up for a while. Russell, could you find David and unmute him, please? There you are, David. You should be able to speak now.
Yes, thank you, Christine. I put this comment on the chat a little earlier. I think probably it got overtaken by ones about electoral processes. But I was very interested in your comment about the 5 guiding principles being deeply rooted in the foundational canons, and particularly your references to Canon A4 and A8. And I say this with particular concern because I'm in the process of preparing for the debate on my private member's motion at General Synod on the 12th of July, based on the 5 guiding principles, and regretting the decision of the Bishop of Burnley to withdraw his acceptance of nomination to the See of Sheffield. It seems a long time ago now, it's 4 years, but we are going to be debating both the 5 guiding principles and, of course, the report of the IDG at Synod on the 12th of July. Whether that's remote or at Church House remains to be seen, I think, later today or tomorrow. But I was very grateful for that reference to the canons, because part of the preparation I've got to do for that debate has got to consider how we put across the 5 guiding principles, how they do encourage flourishing of the church in all its sections today. So thank you for that, Christine.
Thank you, David. I think the reality is that for anybody who cares about the issue at all of the ordination of women, to the episcopate in particular, you cannot be comfortable with all of the 5 principles. There'll be 1 or 2 that you absolutely endorse. They're the ones that you want to emphasize, and there'll be others that cause discomfort. And that's really important, and that they have to be held in tension, and they have to be honoured as a whole, and not picked where I'll go for that one, but not that one. Is my belief about it.
Thank you, David. Bishop Christine, you've really helped us to see that the canons and identifying that there's a duty to those outside the church. And I think that Simon Fisher on the chat has asked a question on that theme. He's saying how he's got quite a long comment in, but then he's ending with, how would you encourage people to be acting according to canonical principles?
Yes, I think this is where, actually, with a real sense of advertisement for the Ecclesiastical Law Society, I think that there are some clergy who willfully break ecclesiastical law. I think there are far more who don't have a clue what it says. And I think that the education arm of the Ecclesiastical Law Society, in the attempt to just make sure that clergy in particular understand and really understand what our system of governance is, our system of law, how it works, what our identity is, the Church of England. And that experience I had with Mark Steadman with the curates in Southwark was fantastic. And they were so grateful, actually. I mean, part of it, their enjoyment, was that Mark Steadman developed the most funny scenarios which they had to look at and answer, as you could possibly imagine. He was very good at that. But it really began to, it was scratching where they were itching. and they wanted to understand more about this. I also think that as that consistory judgment in the judgment of the Christian Court showed that I was quoting from Charles George, it went from 1992 to 2001, and it presumably was because the petitioner did not know until that point that there was an authority to which he had recourse over and above the PCC. So it's not just about it's how do we help people to understand their rights, if you like, particularly laity and those who are not members of the church.
I think that's absolutely right, Bishop Christine. It's the mission of the society to increase the awareness of this, and we're grateful to the work that Russell and his team have done earlier this year in the reading groups, which have proved to be really popular, and hence why
really important, I think.
Really
and
important.
I think, you know, I'm a huge enthusiast for this program, and I think going back again to the understanding that Rowan Williams stated in that introduction to the book, The Complements of Law and Religion, that the law of the church is not an arcane structure that is completely irrelevant and is just a nuisance for us. It's actually about practical ecclesiology. How does our life together recognize and nurture the shared dignity and liberty of the children of God? That's a pretty serious calling, isn't it, for ecclesiastical law?
Yeah, completely. And you know, Russell and Stephen are doing the final Northern Province lecture year on the work they've been doing and discuss about the canons. But I think one of our real difficulties is to even get people to tune into that, to kind of think, oh, the canons, that's important. I mean, there's quite a lot of steps to be done. Another question on this theme is from Richard Bimson. Richard, I don't know if Russell can find you, but you'll give a comment about the richness of the texts of the A canons and how can we promote them to a wider audience within our churches. Not all chapters of the canons may seem very important to the worshipper in the pew, but these seem fundamental to our being, echoing what you've said there.
I suppose it was really your response. I suppose it was really your response to Russell's question that you hadn't paid the A canons much attention, and that you had found a richness in them. And that is coming not only from a bishop, but from a member of this society. And it strikes me that if we're ignoring these fundamental documents, you know, and in some cases they're not as well known to us as they should be, that the person in the pew probably has no concept whatsoever of their existence, or if they do, like my wife, she only thinks that canons start with the letter B, because it's always about, you know, if I'm thinking about something to do with worship and permitted variations, she says there's no other canons apart from B canons, because that's all she ever hears me talk about. But it does seem that somehow we need to sort of promote this, and yes, not chapter B, or you know, or all the ins and outs of chapter G, whatever it is, but then not only within this society, but generally within the wider church.
Yes, I think it's not going to be the case that the text of the A canons is ever going to become a top of the bestseller list of people's reading. But what they enshrine, we can talk about in ways that I think is a compelling narrative, which is true to our identity. Provided that we don't then start to worship the A canons and forget that what really matters is the deeper truth they're trying to express. And that if, you know, so that we don't create false gods, even out of the A canons, of which I've become increasingly fond.
Thank you, Richard, for your question. We've got a question from Mark Smith. Russell, if you could find Mark and you would like to ask your question, if you appear, if not, I will read it out.
Hello, I'm here.
You're here, good. Thank you, Mark.
Hope you can hear me.
Good to see you.
Hello, Christine. Do you remember once you helped me out from the top of a mountain?
I did.
My question is really about where what the fixed point is about what we offer to all. Is it only dictated by what the church says we offer to all, or should it be also an issue for wider society and Parliament, if we are a society to serve those who are not our members? Obviously, I'm thinking about some of the more difficult questions we're facing as the church.
Yes. Do you want to elaborate a bit, so I don't try and guess?
I'm thinking about same-sex marriages,
Okay.
blessings.
Yeah.
Does that help? Does that help?
Yes, it does. I mean, one of the things that I always felt was so important is that there was, at one level, when marriage was only in law of this land between a man and a woman, there was a sense that from the Church of England's point of view, there was no such thing as Christian marriage. There was marriage. Mm-hmm. And if a couple who had not been married before, either of them, wished to have their marriage solemnized in church, and they were parishioners, that was their right to have that happen. And so the law of the church on marriage and the law of the land on marriage, there was no chasm between them. There was a bit on divorce, actually, at one point, and who could officiate and could be remarried in church. But broadly, marriage was marriage. That, of course, changed completely when the law of the land changed to legalize same-sex marriages. And I deeply regret that we now don't have that synergy between the law of the land and the law of the church in this matter. I think given the way it happened, the way that David Cameron brought it in really very quickly, and certainly in Church of England terms, I don't think there could have been any chance that the Church of England would have been able to do the doctrinal work, or even to begin it. So the result was inevitable. It was inevitable, our decision, and that's the case. But I do hope that our identity, as not just being for our members, will help us to take seriously the need to engage with this development. I think we're doing that, to be fair, in LLF, but it's yeah, I don't think that Parliament can require us to officiate at same-sex marriages, for example. That would cause that, you know, well, we would become disestablished, and some would find that a very good move, others wouldn't. But I think we have to. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Parliament was said to be close to moving on women bishops. If the church didn't sort it out, Parliament was going to sort of step in. But I don't think myself that very serious doctrinal and theological debates are ever solved in one side asserting authority over the other.
Thank you for that. I ask, obviously, as a government lawyer as well as
absolutely
one of those interesting areas.
Your life, yes, yes. You're probably in quite a minority here, of course.
Yes.
Mark, thank you for a very, very good question there. And the Paul Goodleaf, you put a couple of questions in the chat box. If Russell can find you, one of them very interesting, where you are talking about Bishop Chris has been talking to us about our identity and the identity of the church, and you are saying that we've evolved where the charity sector has taken on a lot of the Christian values and the benefit of that to British society today. So I wonder if you would like to pick that question up with Bishop Christine.
This is the one that was a bit further up
early on. Yeah, just trying to skip up to make sure the ones I may have missed. I don't know if can you find Paul, Russell?
Yes.
I'm unmuted. Thank you, and thank you.
Oh, there you are, Paul.
Thank you, Christine, for your.
Paul. I'm so lovely to keep seeing wonderful friends.
Christine and I were ecumenical colleagues in Stevenage in the 1990s, so we go back a little way. Yeah, I just think that this idea of the church being the only organisation that exists for the benefit of its non-members remains true, because I think the influence of that in wider, well, Western society, but particularly in this case, British society, has meant that we've almost imbibed it with our mother's milk, that there is this notion of kenotic service of others, and that's part of what it means to be a true citizen. Where does that come from? It didn't come from the Roman Empire. It's not found in other cultures around the world. It comes from our Christology, from our theology, from our understanding of the gospel. And after 2,000 years, thankfully, that has been so influential within society that we take it for granted. But had we not been part of Christendom, I doubt whether we would have acted in that way.
I think that's really interesting, Paul, because it's the thesis of Tom Holland, isn't it, in Dominion, that we cannot help but be formed by this history we have. Is saying exactly, his thesis is exactly yours as you expressed it there, Paul. And I felt, you know, reading that, I felt he was right, and that mostly we don't recognise that. We think we're post-Christian, completely secular, but actually we have no idea why we believe what we believe. Not so much in faith terms, but in these general principles. Yeah, I think it's fascinating, isn't it? So thank you for that. I think that I would be entirely with you on that.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Really, really interesting. Angela Rayner, you raised an interesting question for Bishop Christine, telling us you're still a beginner in understanding church law. I think many of us may, even those who've been along in the tooth, may say that. And I don't know if Russell can find you, if you would like to ask your question.
Thank you. I'm almost certainly an example that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Having now been benefited immensely from this society's reading groups, which ran for a year last year, and now read all of the canons and benefited hugely from that, I'm suddenly aware that when I see pronouncements from a variety of different places and sources and different dioceses, quite often they are about matters concerning worship frequently, which would break the canons. Somebody asks somebody, can they do that? And I said, well, actually, in the canons, they don't need to ask somebody. They can just do that. But I'm a lowly curate in a faraway place. And I just wondered what kind of recourse there is if you're aware that somebody is breaking canon law in a way that is minor or even serious. Where does one take that or go with it?
Right. Great question, Angela. And I think the answer to your question is talk to your archdeacon. As a former archdeacon, that's always a good place to start. But it is a very interesting dilemma that you cite. And particularly as an archdeacon, I was often faced with that very question of being aware that all the time, actually, canon law is being ignored or broken. And if that becomes the normal state of affairs, it's deeply corrosive, actually, because it becomes worse than having no law at all. And if there is something in canon law that is no longer right, we should be changing it. And of course, we do work to change our system of law. It's quite a slow process sometimes, and people can get frustrated. But if we just ignore it altogether, it is corrosive. But I don't think you'd be hugely popular if, as a curate, you went around kind of challenging everybody all over the place. It probably wouldn't win you kind of, popularity curate of the year. I'd leave it to your archdeacon to go in and make a judgment. And even archdeacons, when I was made an archdeacon, somebody gave me a chapter from Trollope's People of the Church on the archdeacon. And Trollope says that a good archdeacon has to be able to know when to ignore something as well as when to enforce something, and to be able to put one or preferably two good bottles of red wine on the table. So, that was a nice lightening up of the approach. But But the point you make is serious when it becomes completely held in disrespect. And we have to ask why. Is it just bad law now in our current context, or are we just cynically changing without that being a proper process? It's been very interesting to me to see how we've managed during COVID, actually, because the requirements of the canons about worship being held in church, public worship being held, obviously we've had to have a complete rethink, haven't we? And I've been very involved, as have other bishops, in issuing directives and giving people specific permissions for what they're doing. So absolutely being pragmatic and saying, yes, of course, do this when they ask, but still requiring that there is some kind of system for saying it isn't a complete free-for-all here.
Wise words. And is there any more questions? I'm hoping we've managed to cover most of the ones in the chat. I think we have. There was a couple of comments in the chat about our ongoing lecture program, and because we hope to have a couple of them back in person. Don't worry, there will still be they will be hopefully recorded, and there will be content online. And we know that lots of our members have enjoyed this online forum, but we're also mindful that lots of members quite like a get together. So we need to do a balance when things get back to a bit more normality. But don't fear, we will still be here having online lectures. So just to cover off those 2 points in the chat. So I think Bishop Christine, we can draw the questions to a close, and it's to me to say just thank you. You have educated us and delighted us, and it's been a real treat to have you. We know how busy your diary is, and I know members will have really enjoyed the opportunity of listening to you and to ask questions in a way that, and say possibly we wouldn't normally have been able to do. So we're really grateful to you. If everybody could, they would clap their hands in the usual way to thank you for joining us. And it's been super. We're really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been lovely to have the opportunity, and I say make acquaintance with new friends and old. It's been marvelous, and I'm not at all sure about education. Actually, it's always very salutary to be in a situation where you are the lay person, if you like, in a group of wonderful legal experts. So thank you for your courtesy, everybody, and kindness to this guest speaker.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thanks, members. And see you all soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.